Okay, let's do this. Showing off your understanding of this concept is one of the best ways, if not the best way, to impress a WACE marker and separate your response from the thousands of others.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the lesson on voice. We'll discuss this in more depth later, but at the outset, I want to acknowledge that this concept is probably the hardest in the entire English ATAR course. That's the bad news, but the good news is that it's only difficult because, as I mentioned at the end of the previous lesson, it requires an understanding of so many other concepts. And because so many students don't understand those other concepts, they think voice is hard. But if you've got the understanding of those previous concepts, voice is actually easy because all you're doing is just considering your understanding of the other concepts. And then if you've got that understanding, you know what voice is. So if you would like to be in the, 1% of year 12s who have a proper understanding of what voice is, make sure you've completed all the lessons in this module prior to this one. At the very least, make sure you've completed the lesson and related activities for language features, language patterns, stylistic choices and features and style, genre and generic conventions, structure, values, assumptions, attitudes and tone, and narrative POV. Here are all the times voice has appeared in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. We have twice in 2016, twice in 2017, twice in 2018, once in 2019, twice in 2020, twice in 2021, and then once in 2022. As was the case with perspective, this concept of voice has appeared in every past WACE exam between 2016 and 2022, and I see no reason why that will change for your WACE exam. In other words, I will put money on this concept being in your WACE exam come November. With that in mind, it might surprise you to see that voice only pops up in 2 syllabus points, 2 out of the 40. First one, analysing the use of voice and narrative POV. Second one, using appropriate language and stylistic features to sustain a personal voice and perspective. A couple of things to note from this slide. We have voice and narrative POV being connected in the one syllabus point. And in the other one, we have voice and perspective being connected. That is a little bit of foreshadowing for what's to come later. Lesson objectives. Firstly, we will define voice. We'll do that by outlining the elements of the definition. Then we'll explain element 1, concepts that influence the construction of voice. We'll discuss analogy number 1, outline the concepts that influence the construction of voice, discuss analogy that is meant to say analogy number 2, bad Linux. Then we'll move on to explain element number 2, types of voice. We'll explain the concepts that influence the construction of each type of voice. Then we'll move on to element number 3, and that will be words to describe/characterize voice. Then we'll move on to element number 4, which are texts that are commonly used to analyze or create voice in English ATAR. After that, analyze some past WACE exam questions, discuss how to analyze voice, discuss how to create voice, and then we're not done yet. We'll explain multiple voices, discuss example number 1, discuss example number 2, and finally, we will outline a simple summary. Starting with a trusty old definition of voice, here is how the glossary defines it. Voice, in a literary sense, is the distinct personality of a piece of writing. Voice can be created through the use of syntax, punctuation, vocabulary choices, persona, and dialogue. Texts often contain multiple voices. These are the views, positions, ideas, and perspectives of individuals or groups. It is important to recognize the various voices in a text, how they relate to one another, and how the creator of a text uses these to shape audience response. To be honest, this definition isn't really that helpful, and it's actually a bit misleading. It's a bit misleading because it says that voice is the distinct personality of a piece of writing. Voice is a concept that applies to visual and multimodal texts as well as written texts. So the fact that this definition doesn't refer to those other types of text, those other modes of text, is misleading. In light of that, we're going to go with the following definition: the construction of an author, director, or narrator's personality in a text. This definition has several different factors that we're going to be focusing on throughout this lesson. I don't know if you can recall much about the lesson on context, but our definition for context had various elements, and throughout the majority of that lesson on context, we broke the definition down and we addressed each element separately. That's what we'll be doing in relation to this definition. Anyway, despite the fact that this definition has multiple elements, if you can associate this concept of voice with just one thing, one word, it should be this: the word personality. Analogy number 1 discusses this key takeaway in more depth, and we'll get to that in a few minutes' time. So just flag this key takeaway in your mind now. I'm not going to explain the nitty-gritty of it because it's coming soon. Moving on to the elements of the definition, as I just mentioned, our definition of voice forms the kind of overview of what this lesson will be doing, which is looking at each individual element of that definition. We have 4 elements. The first one is the word construction, and that refers to concepts that influence the construction of voice. The next element refers to the 3 overarching types of voice, and they are authorial voice, the author's voice, directorial voice, the director's voice, and narratorial voice, the narrator's voice. In other words, the author's personality, the director's personality, or the narrator's personality. Speaking of personality, that is our next element, and this really refers to how you describe or characterize a voice. And our last element is the word text. This refers to texts that are commonly used to analyze or create voice. We'll look at each element separately and then bring it all together at the end. Starting with element 1, which is the concepts that influence the construction of voice. In this section of the lesson, we're focusing on this element of the definition. Before we take a look at those concepts, I want you to forget about English ATAR for a second. Instead, I want you to think about the personality of one of your best mates. The word personality in everyday life refers to the combination of characteristics or qualities that form an individual's distinctive character. And that definition comes from the Oxford Dictionary of English, ODE. This definition is really telling us that someone's personality is really just a construct or a combination of various characteristics. So we know what the word personality means, and hopefully you've thought about the personality of one of your best mates. The next question is, how would you describe your best mate's personality in a few words? One of my best mates is Angus. And even though there are lots of things to say about Angus's personality, I'm just going to use the following words: conversational and curious. As we know, someone's personality is a construct of their characteristics. So Angus must exhibit some characteristics that led me to describe his personality as conversational and curious. A few of those characteristics are the genuine interest he has in people from all walks of life, his willingness to have a chat with anyone about anything, and his ability to ask himself and others meaningful questions. So it is that combination of characteristics that led me to describe Angus's personality as conversational and curious. To represent this in a more visual way, combination of characteristics lead to personality. That's the theory, and our example is of Angus. And the combination of characteristics are his genuine interest, his willingness to have a chat, and his ability to ask meaningful questions. Those characteristics, the combination of those characteristics, lead to his conversational and curious personality. Voice in English ATAR is the exact same. It's a combination of various concepts that form an author, narrator, or director's personality. Speaking of concepts, here are the concepts that influence the construction of voice. We have tone. We know tone is created through diction and syntax. So the question that we would want to ask ourselves here is, how does the use of diction and syntax in the text construct the author or narrator's personality? Narrative POV, The question to ask is, how does the use of narrative POV influence the narrator's personality? Language features. The question to ask is, what written and/or visual language features are used in the text that construct the author, narrator, or director's personality? What stylistic choices are made in the text that constructs the author, director, or narrator's personality? How does the genre of form and structure and the genre of subject matter and the conventions of each influence the construction of the author, director, or narrator's personality? What does the author, director, or narrator's use of structural features reveal about their personality? What perspectives are represented in the text, and how do they influence the construction of the author, director, or narrator's personality? Finally, how does the author, director, or narrator's cultural and situational context influence the personality that's conveyed in the text? A quick aside. There's this survey on the English Teachers Association of Western Australia's website, which reveals that English ATAR students regard this concept of voice as the most difficult in the entire subject. It's regarded as the hardest because all of these concepts influence the construction of voice. In other words, without these concepts, you can't have voice. I've said this many times already, but if you don't understand these concepts, voice will obviously be very hard. This is precisely why all of these concepts have been addressed prior to this lesson. Please make sure you've watched the lessons and completed the activities for these concepts. If you continue watching this lesson without having completed the activities for these concepts, you're just not going to get the most value out of the rest of this lesson, and your understanding of voice won't be complete. Voice is a piece of sushi. Another way to understand the relationship between the concepts that influence the construction of voice and the concept of voice itself is to analogize it with a piece of sushi. Voice is the piece of sushi itself, and the concepts that influence the construction of voice are the ingredients that are used to make the piece of sushi. In other words, the way in which the following concepts or ingredients are used will determine what the type of voice is or what the type of sushi is. So for the rest of this lesson, we're going to pretend that each concept that influence the construction of voice represents an ingredient. Tone will be tofu, narrative POV will be avocado, language features will be rice, stylistic choices and features will be a cucumber, genre and generic conventions will be seaweed, structural features will be a carrot, perspective will be soy sauce, and context of production will be ginger. This will make a bit more sense in a sec as we transition to the next element of the definition of voice, and that is the types of voice, element 2. This element refers to this part of the definition, the words author, director, and narrator. As we established at the beginning of the lesson, there are 3 types of voice. The first one is authorial voice, that refers to the author's voice. The next one is directorial voice, that refers to the director's voice. Just a quick side note about directorial voice. The 2 main categories that almost every English teacher will recognize are authorial voice and our third type of voice, which is narratorial voice. In other words, they will say that the 2 types of voice are authorial voice and narratorial voice. Essentially, I've just added in this term directorial voice. Why? Technically, authorial voice is the term used to describe both the author's voice and the director's voice. So in an exam, you could write the authorial voice of Christopher Nolan, who's a director, and you could write the authorial voice of J.K. Rowling, who, as we probably know, is a writer and author. Both of those sentences would be right. The marker wouldn't bat an eyelid. However, I've included the term directorial voice because, as we'll soon see, the concepts that influence the construction of an author's voice slightly differ from the concepts that influence the construction of a director's voice. So, to be clear, directorial voice is a completely valid term to use when you write about the voice of a multimodal text, such as a documentary or a movie, in an assessment context. I know that it is a valid term to use because it was extensively addressed in a 2-hour lecture just on voice at UWA, and it was presented by someone who works with the English Teachers Association of Western Australia. I was present at that lecture. Directorial voice is a thing. The 2-hour lecture is linked in the resources tab below the video. Go give it a watch and come back once you're done. Nah, just joking. Our third and final type of voice, as we know by this stage, is narrative voice, and that just refers to the narrator's voice. I just realized I've been saying narratorial voice over the last few minutes. Ignore that. Narrative voice is much easier, and it is the right term to use. How should we apply each type of voice in an assessment context? We should use the term authorial voice in an assessment to refer to the voice of an author of a written text. We should use the term directorial voice in an assessment to refer to the voice of a director of a feature film, documentary, or TV show. And we should use the term narrative voice to refer to the voice of a narrator in a written or multimodal or visual text. We've just looked at all the various concepts that influence the construction of voice, and we've also looked at the 3 different types of voice. Now let's look at the concepts that influence the construction of each type of voice. Here is our key for understanding how these concepts relate to each type of voice. The underlined concepts that we're about to see, I regard as very relevant for each type of voice. Very relevant means that you should try and address these concepts in a response about the certain type of voice. I've also italicized and emboldened the concept that I believe is super relevant for each type of voice. Super relevant means you should definitely address this concept in a response about the specific type of voice. Let's look at authorial voice first, and we'll take a look at the main ingredients or the main concepts. Tone is the super relevant concept for authorial voice. The very relevant concepts are written language features, stylistic choices and features, and genre and generic conventions. Together, these ingredients equal tofu and cucumber sushi. So if you are discussing authorial voice, you definitely need to discuss tone, and you should try to incorporate a good discussion of these other concepts. You've also got the option to add a discussion of structural features, which are the carrots, perspective, which is the soy sauce, and context of production, which is the ginger. Those 3 ingredients or concepts are a last priority. Your main priority when discussing authorial voice should be the stuff on the slide. Why are those concepts the most important for authorial voice? We know that tone is created through syntax and diction, and we know that syntax and diction is determined by the style of writing and language used by the author. The tone is the super relevant concept. The written language features and the stylistic features are the very relevant concepts. In addition to this, style and language are heavily influenced by the genres that the text belongs to. For instance, a novel is more likely to use figurative language than a persuasive speech, which is more likely to use rhetorical devices. A quick note before we move on to directorial voice. And that note is an author's voice or personality in a text does not necessarily equal the author's personality in real life. Rather, an author's voice, the authorial voice, is deliberately constructed to achieve the text's particular purpose. For instance, if I wrote a persuasive speech that insisted that pineapple on pizza is an abomination, which it is, you might say my voice in that speech is demanding and persistent. However, just because my voice or personality in that text is demanding and persistent, that doesn't automatically translate to my personality in real life also being demanding and persistent. In this case, I have deliberately constructed that demanding and persistent voice to achieve my text's particular purpose of convincing the audience that pineapple on pizza is an abomination. Moving on to directorial voice, what are the main ingredients? Our super relevant concept is stylistic choices and features. Our very relevant concepts are visual language features, genre and generic conventions, and structural features. Collectively, these make up cucumber and carrot sushi, and we have the option to add perspective, some soy sauce, or context of production, some ginger. What is the rationale for picking those concepts on the previous slide as the super relevant and very relevant concepts? Style is the super relevant concept, and the style of the director is the easiest way to discuss directorial voice. A better way to understand this is to ask yourself, what does the director do in, say, the movie that makes them unique? Or what does the director do that is common throughout all of their movies? The combination of those things equals the directorial voice. For instance, Christopher Nolan's style involves using real filming locations, having men in suits, using visual paradoxes, Inception, using temporal shifts or shifts in time, such as in Tenet, having embedded narratives, using documentary-style lighting, using handheld cameras, muted colors, and wide close-ups for dialogue scenes. The style, language, and structure are heavily influenced by the genre the text relates to. For instance, temporal shifts are common in sci-fi movies. That's how all of these key concepts interrelate. Moving on to our third and final type of voice, narrative voice. Here are the main ingredients. We have narrative POV, which is the super relevant concept. We also have tone, which is a very relevant concept, language features, and stylistic choices and features, and also genre and generic conventions. All of these ingredients are used to make avocado, tofu, and cucumber sushi, with the option to add structural features, some carrot, perspective, some soy sauce, and context of production, some ginger. Why are those 5 concepts most important when it comes to the construction of narrative voice? Most importantly, narrative POV has the biggest impact on narrative voice. We know from the lesson on narrative POV that there are 3 questions to ask when we're analyzing it. Question number 1 is, who is the narrator? Question number 2 is, what point of view does the narrator tell the story from? And that refers to the type of POV. And question number 3, how can we describe the narrator? And that refers to the type of narrator. When the question includes the concept narrative POV, the most important question for you to address is, what is the type of POV? For instance, first person central, second person, third person omniscient, third person limited, third person objective. However, when the question includes the concept voice, the most important question for you to address is, what is the type of narrator? And for types of narrators, we know that overall we have 2. We have internal and external. Focusing on internal, we know that there are unreliable and reliable narrators. For unreliable narrators, there's the picaro and the liar, there's the madman, and there's the naif. Then for reliable, we know that the narrator will be reliable if they're not unreliable. So that's internal narrators. And then for external narrators, there are detached, subjective, intrusive, and omniscient external narrators. The question arises, why is narrative POV so important for narrative voice? To take a step back, we know the type of POV determines the distance between the narrator and the protagonist. For instance, if the narrative POV is first person central, in this case, the narrator is the protagonist. The distance is so close that it's the same thing. However, if the narrative POV is third person omniscient, the distance from the narrator and the protagonist is quite great. That's the type of POV, but for type of narrator, that is so important because it determines the narrator's voice. For instance, let's look at Forrest Gump's narration in Forrest Gump. The narrator, who is Forrest Gump, is unreliable because of his inexperience and ignorance. He is the naif.
Life was like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get.
This type of narrator contributes to the creation of a playful, cheery, and naive narrative voice. Compare that to Alec Baldwin's narration in The Royal Tenenbaums. This detached narration in The Royal Tenenbaums constructs an informative and dry narrative voice.
Royal Tenenbaum bought the house on Archer Avenue in the winter of his 35th year. Over the next decade, he and his wife had 3 children, and then they separated.
So that is why narrative POV is so important for narrative voice. Specifically, the type of narrator is important for narrative voice. And if we have a think about that, it makes sense. If we're asking ourselves what sort of person is telling the story, that will definitely relate to that person's personality. Quickly referring to those other very relevant concepts that influence the construction of narrative voice. The narrative POV goes hand in hand with those other concepts of tone, language features, stylistic features, and genre. For instance, an informal and irreverent tone might construct the narrator's voice as naive. In this case, language features and stylistic features will be used to construct the tone and complement the creation of the naive voice. As with the other types of voice, the style and language are heavily influenced by the genre or genres the text belongs to. For instance, a crime novel is likely to employ different stylistic and language features compared to, say, a rom-com. Moving on to element 3, which is words to describe or characterize voice. This element relates to this part of our definition. It relates to the word personality. And remember that first key takeaway of the lesson, voice equals personality. Another key takeaway is that you should use adjectives to describe an author, director, or narrator's voice. In English ATAR, it's very important to describe the nature of the voice. And the easiest way to do this is by using an adjective or adjectives. Hopefully, you'll recall that we looked at this table at the beginning of this module in the lesson on style. As I mentioned in that lesson, we can use the adjectives to describe style to describe voice. This table is in the PDF study notes for this lesson. To emphasize the importance of using one or more adjectives to describe voice, I'd like to return to the earlier example of Angus's personality. Let's say Beth asks me, how would you describe Angus's personality? I respond saying, Angus has a personality. This response doesn't answer Beth's question. A better response to Beth's question would be, Angus has a curious and conversational personality. These two words, curious and conversational, are adjectives I am using to describe Angus's personality. The same principle applies to the concept of voice in English ATAR. If you're answering an analytical question that includes the word voice, but you fail to describe the nature of the voice, this is the equivalent of me saying, Angus has a personality. You're not answering the question. Our final element, element 4, which refers to texts that are commonly used to analyze and create voice in English ATAR. This is the part of our overarching definition of voice that this element relates to, and this element is really getting at this question. What sort of texts should I analyze and create voice in? Here are those texts. You can expect to analyze and create voice in these texts because these texts enable a text creator's personality to really shine. Voice can be analyzed or created in other genres of form and structure, but the ones you see in this table are really the main ones. And as always, this table is in the PDF study notes. Past WACE exam questions. How you tackle a question on voice depends on a number of factors, but the most relevant is what section of the exam is the question in. By this stage, we know that if you are answering a comprehending section question or a responding section question, you're looking at an analytical question. You're analyzing a text. If you're answering a question in the composing section, you're answering a creative question. You are creating a text. So in this part of the lesson, we're going to look at how we can analyze voice in the comprehending and responding section and create voice in the composing section. Note that creating voice will just be skimmed over because we look at creating voice extensively in Module 5. So how do we analyze voice? We have some questions to ask. Firstly, what is the type of voice? Is it authorial? Is it directorial? Or is it narrative? Secondly, we have what concepts influence the construction of the voice. Note that you must make sure that you refer to any concepts that are actually mentioned in the question. Next question, what is the significance of each concept in relation to the text voice, i.e. list relevant examples of each concept and explain each example's influence on the voice with reference to features, devices, and conventions where possible. Next question, how would you describe the voice? This just requires you to use adjectives. And final question, what is the purpose and or effect of the voice? In an exam context, this step requires you to relate the voice element of the question to the other elements of the question. Let's take a look at analyzing authorial voice first, specifically in relation to a comprehending section question. And that question is, explain how the writer's voice in text 1 is constructed through language features. 2020, section 1, question 1. Text 1 is a memoir titled The Best in the World, a love letter to Australia's public pools, and it's just an excerpt. You can find the full memoir in the resources tab below the video, but I'll read out the relevant excerpt now. My parents were Cantonese migrants from Hong Kong who, in the 1970s, moved to Queensland's Sunshine Coast, home to some of the country's most beautiful beaches. It still strikes me as a slightly baffling decision, given neither of them could swim. Water compelled and terrified them and their 5 Australian-born kids. While other people saw stunning coastlines, we just saw a picturesque way to die. Rips could kill you, people said. Sharks could kill you. Skin cancer could kill you. Weirdly, it was always white people who told us these things, the same white people who seemed to keep going to the beach. Were we missing something? Did they want to die? A safer option was the public pool. Years of TV safety campaigns had convinced Mum we needed to know how to swim, because she sure as hell couldn't save us if we were drowning. Throughout summer, we'd wail as Mum drove us to the nearest suburban leisure centre for lessons. I suspect we dreaded those lessons as much as our instructors dreaded teaching us, those hopeless Asian kids spluttering with anxiety inside the enclosed training pool. Those stinking hothouses of chemicals, piss and wet togs, or cozies, or bathers, or swimmers, depending on your state. After the nightmare was over, we'd be sedated with a treat, a redskin. Australians veer towards racism, even with our confectionery, an ice block or a packet of frogs, before falling asleep in the stuffy Ford Cortina, hair matted to our temples, seatbelts twisted in our skin, and fingers dusted orange from the twisties we stole from each other. The horror didn't end there. At school, not only were swimming lessons mandatory, carnivals were too. Annual school-run swim meets, ostensibly fun but deeply competitive. We even had togs in school colours that we had to buy from the uniform shop. During the lessons, I'd watch fit white kids dive in and carve through water with graceful limbs that seemed custom-built for the job. Meanwhile, in lane 1 or 6, where I could still hold onto the wall, I'd windmill uselessly, my hands banging into the water like saucepans. There was a direct, inverse correlation between the amount of splashing I made and the distance I travelled. That is our excerpt. Let's analyse the voice in it, starting with our first question, what is the type of voice? The type of voice is authorial. Why? Because the question stipulates, explain the writer's voice in text 1. The word writer in this context is just another word for author. Next question is, what concepts influence the construction of voice? Written language features and stylistic choices and features. Specifically, tone, because tone is created through language features. It's created through syntax and diction. Next question, what is the significance of each concept in relation to the text voice? We have some irony. Irony refers to the expression of the meaning of language that normally refers to the opposite of that meaning. For instance, here we have the title of the memoir, The Best in the World, a love letter to Australia's public pools. The words best and love imply that the text will depict Australian public pools in a favourable light. That's what the meaning of those words suggest, but in actual fact, the text doesn't really depict those pools in a favourable light. These words end up having the opposite meaning. And this next point really reinforces what I just said. These are examples of descriptive language: stinking hothouses, nightmare, horror. And this descriptive language contradicts the title's implication that the author will present a favourable account of public pools. Some further examples, we have a simile, specifically, my hands banging into the water like saucepans. This simile underscores the author's unpleasant experience with public pools in a playful manner. We also have some imagery, some slang, and some colloquialisms. Focusing on this phrase, chemicals, piss, and wet togs. We've got olfactory imagery, which refers to imagery that evokes a sense of smell, in conjunction with the use of a slang word, piss, and a colloquialism, wet togs, further assists in the construction of a satirical tone by insinuating that Australia's public pools are far from, as the title would suggest, the best in the world. So, as a result of all of those things above that we've just discussed, we have the creation of a satirical and humorous tone. Next question, how would you describe the voice? Quite simply, we could say it is a mocking voice, a mocking authorial voice. Final question, what is the purpose and or effect of the voice? The overarching effect of the author's voice is to present a bittersweet depiction of Australian public pools that can only fully be appreciated by those who have actually swum in them. You'll see in the PDF study notes that there are a few notes about how you can incorporate a discussion of some other concepts that influence the construction of the authorial voice. Pause the video now to have a quick look at those. Okay, that is our step-by-step analysis of the voice in the text. This is how all the stuff that we just discussed comes together in an actual response. The use of irony, similes, and imagery construct a mocking authorial voice. Law's mocking voice is highlighted by the irony of the text title, The Best in the World, a Love Letter to Australia's Public Pools. Using the words best and love in the title implies the text will depict Australia's public pools in a favourable light. This implication is immediately contradicted as Law uses descriptive language like stinking, nightmare, and horror throughout the text to describe public pools in Australia, establishing a satirical tone. In addition to the use of irony, Law employs a simile while recounting his experience in a public pool as a child. Law notes that while the white kids were gracefully carving through the water, his hands were banging into the water like saucepans. This comparison between his swimming technique, or lack thereof, and the banging of saucepans underscores Law's unpleasant experience with public pools in a playful manner. It is just one of the many instances of his self-deprecating, humorous tone in the text. Law also appeals to the reader's olfactory senses by describing an indoor public pool he swam in as a child as a hothouse of chemicals, piss, and wet togs, a combination of scents many Australians are familiar with. The olfactory imagery, in conjunction with the use of a slang word, piss, and a colloquialism, wet togs, further assists in constructing a satirical tone by insinuating that Australia's public pools are far from the best in the world. Ultimately, Law's use of irony, simile, and imagery work together to underscore the text's satirical and humorous tone, which in turn constructs a mocking voice. Hopefully, you can see how the answers that we came up with in answering each question were then incorporated into this response. So that is an example of analyzing authorial voice in relation to a comprehending section question. Let's check out an example of analyzing directorial voice in relation to a responding section question. And that question is, explore how voice works within at least one text to represent a particular context. 2017, section 2, question 5. And our sample text is Dunkirk, directed by Christopher Nolan, 2017. I've included a little interview of Christopher Nolan that kind of describes the relevant part of the text that we're going to discuss. So go and give that a watch. It's in the resources tab below the video. Come back once you're done. Analyzing voice in the text, starting with our first question, what is the type of voice? No surprises here. The type of voice is directorial. Why? The question doesn't specify what type of voice we should discuss. So if it doesn't specify, we can choose whichever type we want. Next question, what concepts influence the construction of the voice? We've got visual language features and stylistic choices and features, and we have structural features. Focusing on the visual language features and stylistic choices and features first in answering the next question. What is the significance of each concept in relation to the text voice? Let's discuss the use of color. Each timeline uses its own unique color scheme. Air uses sky blue, sea uses dark blue, land uses white. These unique color schemes enable the audience to easily identify which story is being told. The use of color in this way is quite groundbreaking and influences the construction of Nolan's experimental voice. Turning to sound, in that interview that you just watched, Nolan says, "I don't agree with the idea that you can only achieve clarity through dialogue. Clarity of story, clarity of emotions. I try to achieve that in a very layered way using all the different things at my disposal, picture and sound." In essence, Nolan is known for having extremely loud sound, like music and sound effects that can make the dialogue hard to hear. That quote that I just read out from the interview is basically saying that Nolan often will intentionally make the dialogue difficult to hear by raising the sound of the music and sound effects. That is something that is normally avoided. It's actively avoided by directors. So the fact that Nolan is doing this deliberately is contributing to his experimental voice. We've also got handheld cameras, and specifically IMAX cameras. IMAX cameras are notoriously large and hefty things to move around. IMAX cameras and handheld would typically never go in the same sentence. That being said, extensive handheld IMAX camera work was accomplished by the director of photography, Hoyt van Hoytema. Van Hoytema often had to man a rig weighing approximately 30 kilos. Nolan continually pushes the limits of what's possible with these IMAX cameras, which, as I've just said, are notoriously heavy. His use of these cameras in a multitude of handheld camera scenes further contributes to the construction of his experimental voice. Turning to structural features. The points of view are divided into 3 strands: land, sea, and air. I've left a video to a more in-depth explanation of Dunkirk's structure in the resources tab below the video if you're interested, but it's not compulsory. In short, the relevant structural features are shifts in time and shifts in place. So the different storylines run at different paces. The movie's runtime is 106 minutes. We've got the land storyline, the sea storyline, and the air storyline. And this is the point at which they converge, or as Nolan says, the point of confluence. The land storyline takes place in the movie over the course of a week. The sea storyline takes place over the course of 1 day. And the air storyline takes place over the course of 1 hour. Focusing on the land strand first, over the course of the movie, we see a contrast between periods of immense tension and horror, and then stretches of boredom, where they're just waiting around. The sea strand shows the evacuation by the Navy, and it shows how civilians came to the rescue. And the air strand shows a Spitfire pilot in a dogfight, which is an extraordinarily tense and focused timescale that stretches and makes the hour feel long. The use of 3 different timelines that run at 3 different paces hasn't really been expertly executed in a blockbuster movie before, namely because of the difficulty in pulling it off. Nolan's execution of this structure led Quentin Tarantino to name Dunkirk his second favorite film of the 2010s, behind The Social Network, and consolidated his experimental voice. Moving on to the next question, how would you describe the voice? Surprise, surprise, experimental. Finally, what is the purpose and/or effect of the voice? The overarching purpose of Nolan's experimental directorial voice is to represent the events of Dunkirk in an unconventionally captivating way. As with the previous example, there are some notes in the PDF that discuss how you could incorporate a discussion of some other concepts that influence the construction of the directorial voice. Related to that, I also wrote an introduction to this question, which we won't address here on the slide. So in light of that, pause the video, go and give those other notes and that introduction a read, and come back once you're done. As you're reading the introduction, you'll also see that there is a body paragraph beneath it. We'll read that body paragraph out together once you read the introduction. Nolan's experimental voice is epitomized by his fascination with time and how it can be manipulated in film through various structural features. The story of his 2000 movie Memento intercuts 2 timelines, one moving backward. Additionally, Nolan's 2010 blockbuster hit Inception intercuts 4 times, which are all framed by a 5th. Dunkirk is arguably the director's most adventurous exploration of time and how it can be used to represent a particular context. Nolan utilizes shifts in time and place to represent the evacuation of soldiers from 3 different points of view, with each running at a different pace. The first point of view, land, portrays the turbulent experience of the infantry on the beach of Dunkirk over 1 week. The second point of view, sea, depicts the efforts of British civilians and the Navy to rescue the infantry over 1 day. The last point of view, air, conveys an extraordinarily intense and focused dogfight between an Allied Spitfire pilot and a German Luftwaffe pilot over 1 hour. The ultimate point of confluence of each point of view is depicted in the final act of Dunkirk, where each storyline converges in both time and space to enable the Allied soldiers to be evacuated. This manipulation of structure painted a broad, coherent picture of the event and represented it as a triumph of timing rather than a victory over the German army. In this way, the influence of Nolan's experimental voice on the representation of the situational context of Dunkirk is clearly exhibited. Okay, that is analyzing voice, and we've just looked at an example in relation to analyzing authorial voice and then analyzing directorial voice. Let's take a look at creating voice. As I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, we'll be focusing extensively on creating voice in Module 5, and this part of the lesson isn't necessarily related to a past WACE exam question per se. The main objective is to illustrate how the concepts that influence the construction of a narrative voice can be used to create such a voice in an imaginative text. And we're going to look at this sample text. It's called Project Hail Mary, written by Andy Weir. Andy Weir is the guy who wrote The Martian, and then The Martian was adapted into a movie directed by Ridley Scott, and it had Matt Damon in it.
Matt Damon. Matt Damon! Matt Damon!
Project Hail Mary is currently being adapted into a movie with Ryan Gosling, and I'm very excited for that movie to come out. It might have come out by the time you're watching this. The reason that we're looking at this extract rather than me just writing my own part of a short story is because I think this extract will illustrate how the various concepts can be used to create narrative voice much better than I could. Here's the extract. I'm wearing a breathing mask. It's tight to my face and connected to a hose that goes behind my head. Can I get up? No, but I can move my head a little. I look down at my body. I'm naked and connected to more tubes than I can count. There's 1 in each arm, 1 in each leg, 1 in my gentleman's equipment, and 2 that disappear under my thigh. I'm guessing one of them is up where the sun doesn't shine. That can't be good. Also, I'm covered with electrodes. The sensor type stickers like for an EKG, but they're all over the place. Well, at least they're only on my skin instead of jammed into me. Where? I wheeze. I try again. Where am I? What's the cube root of 8? The computer asks. Where am I? I say again. This time it's easier. Incorrect. What's the cube root of 8? I take a deep breath and speak slowly. 2 times e to the 2i pi. Incorrect. What's the cube root of 8? But I wasn't incorrect. I just wanted to see how smart the computer was. Answer, not very. 2, I say. Correct. I listen for follow-up questions, but the computer seems satisfied. I'm tired. I drift off to sleep again. That's our excerpt. Let's have a look at the main concepts that are used in that excerpt to construct a narrative voice. Firstly, we have narrative POV. So turning to this part of the inquiry, when we're analysing narrative POV, our first question is, who is the narrator? And the narrator at this stage of the story is an unnamed male character. Next question, what is the type of POV? The type of POV is first person central. How do we know that? In the text, we've got the use of the word I'm, as in I'm wearing, and he also says tight to my face, my, and he also says I wheeze, I. So the use of the words I'm, my, and I tell us that there is first person central narrative POV. This is our most important question when we're looking at narrative POV in relation to voice. That is the type of narrator. The type of narrator is unreliable and probably the naif. Some examples that indicate that the narrator is unreliable. I'm wearing a breathing mask. It's tight to my face and connected to a hose that goes behind my head. Where am I? I'm naked and connected to more tubes than I can count. Those parts of the text tell us the protagonist is unreliable, or at least at this stage of the novel, because he can't really give the reader an accurate explanation of what's going on. He doesn't know where he is, and he's surprised by the fact that there are multiple tubes connected to him. So that is the narrative POV, and that is the super relevant concept when we're looking at narrative voice. Some other very relevant concepts are written language features and patterns and stylistic features and choices. Specifically, euphemisms. A euphemism is a mild or indirect way of expressing a harsh, blunt, or embarrassing thing. Some examples of euphemisms. I'm guessing one of them is up where the sun doesn't shine. There's one in each arm, one in each leg, one in my gentleman's equipment. We also have some mathematical jargon. 2 times e to the 2i pi. Looking at tone, we could say the tone is humorous. As we know, tone is created through diction and syntax. Relating that to the text, we could say the euphemisms and instances of brief syntax contribute to the creation of this humorous tone. Looking at genre and generic conventions, focusing on the genre of form and structure first, it's a novel. Turning to the genre of subject matter, it's sci-fi. So what are some conventions of sci-fi novels? There are normally computers and sort of electronics, and we're seeing those conventions within that excerpt of the text that we just read out. So, in light of all of that stuff, how might we describe the narrative voice? Some words that came to mind for me: confused, comical, and knowledgeable. In other words, we have the creation of a confused, comical, and knowledgeable narrative voice through those parts of the excerpt that we just discussed. That is creating voice, and that is the past WACE exams section of this lesson done and dusted. Final main section of the lesson, multiple voices. You might recall that this term, multiple voices, appears in the syllabus glossary in this specific part. Texts often contain multiple voices. These are the views, positions, ideas, and perspectives of individuals or groups. It is important to recognize the various voices in a text, how they relate to one another, and how the creator of a text uses these to shape audience response. Multiple voices basically equals multiple perspectives. On that note, a key takeaway in relation to multiple voices doesn't refer to the presence of more than one type of voice, so one type of authorial, directorial, or narrative voice in a text. Instead, it refers to the fact that each person or group of people in a text has a voice, and each voice can be used to communicate a perspective. Let's take a look at a couple of examples to illustrate this. Example 1, we'll take a look at this question. Discuss how at least one text marginalizes or emphasizes a voice to privilege a perspective. Hopefully this sounds familiar. Sample text, the true story of the 3 little pigs, which we looked at in the previous lesson on perspective. The text emphasizes Alexander T. Wolfe's voice to privilege his perspective that the original story of the 3 little pigs is one-sided and unfairly portrays him as a big baddie. So, in the true story of the 3 little pigs, Mr. Wolfe's voice is emphasized. There are multiple voices. There are the voices of the 3 little pigs, but the one that we see the most of is Mr. Wolfe's. And because Mr. Wolfe's voice is emphasized, his perspective that the 3 little pigs is one-sided and unfairly portrays Mr. Wolfe as a big baddie, that perspective is privileged. A second and final example. Analyze how different attitudes or perspectives are communicated through the construction of voices in one text. So with this question, we're looking at how attitudes or perspectives are communicated through the construction of voices. We'll briefly discuss this example in relation to a familiar text, Captain America Civil War. We also looked at this one in the previous lesson. And we're reusing this text because our prior understanding of it is just going to help us understand how to attack this question. In short, Team Cap is one voice, Team Iron Man is another voice. Collectively, we have multiple voices. So what we could do here is discuss how perspectives are communicated through the construction of Team Cap and the construction of Team Iron Man. For instance, how is the tension between both groups or voices constructed to communicate their respective perspectives on the Sokovia Accords? That's all the main content for the lesson. let's do a simple summary. First part of this lesson, we looked at the definition of voice, which formed the basis of really this whole lesson. That definition is the construction of an author, director, or narrator's personality in a text. Key takeaway here, if you're going to take away really one thing from this lesson, if you're going to associate voice with one thing, one word, it is personality. Then we looked at the elements of the definition, and one of those is construction. Construction refers to the concepts that influence the construction of voice. Another element is the words author, director, or narrator. They refer to types of voice. Element 3 is the word personality. This refers to words to describe or characterize the voice. And the fourth and final element is text, and this refers to texts that are commonly used to analyze voice in English ATAR. From there, we went into a discussion of each element, starting with element 1, concepts that influence the construction of voice. We discussed a few analogies in this part of the lesson. The first one, analogy 1, is voice just equals the personality of your best mate. We saw that the word personality really just refers to the combination of characteristics. That combination leads to you being able to describe someone's personality. For instance, we discussed the example of one of my best mates, Angus. A few characteristics of his: he has a genuine interest in others, he has a willingness to have a chat with people from all walks of life, and he has the ability to ask himself and others meaningful questions. That combination of characteristics leads to his personality, which I would describe as conversational and curious. That first analogy led us to discuss the concepts that influence the construction of voice, which we'll summarize in a few moments' time. And in this part of the lesson, I really emphasize that your ability to successfully tackle a question on voice hinges on your understanding of these concepts. So many students rank this concept of voice as the hardest in English ATAR because it requires an understanding of all those other concepts. And it's so hard for those students because they simply just don't know what those other concepts mean. If you've watched all the lessons and completed all the activities up to this point in the course, you know what those other concepts mean. So I'm hoping voice hasn't been too tricky to understand. Anyway, next analogy was that voice is just a piece of sushi. In this analogy, tone equals tofu, narrative POV, avocado, language features and patterns, rice, stylistic choices and features, cucumber, genre and generic conventions, seaweed, structural features, carrot, perspective, soy sauce, context, ginger. Next, element of our overarching definition of voice, types of voice. We have authorial voice. We refer to that one as tofu and cucumber sushi. And the primary concept is tone. That is the super relevant concept. The secondary concepts, or the very relevant concepts, are written language features, stylistic choices and features, and genre and generic conventions. Some optional concepts are structural features, perspective, and context. Our next type of voice was directorial voice, or cucumber and carrot sushi. The primary concept, or super relevant concept, was stylistic choices and features. The secondary concepts, or very relevant concepts, were visual language features, genre and generic conventions, and structural features. Optional concepts were perspective and context. Our final type of voice is narrative voice, and that is avocado, tofu, and cucumber sushi. The primary or super relevant concept is narrative POV. The secondary or very relevant concepts are tone, language features, stylistic choices and features, genre and generic conventions, with the options to add perspective, context, and structural features. Next section of the lesson was element 3, words to describe or characterize voice. We learnt here that you must use adjectives to describe an author, director, or narrator's voice. Final main element of the definition, texts that are commonly used to analyze and create voice in English ATAR. See the table in the PDF study notes. From there, we looked at past WACE exam questions and we looked at how to analyze voice first. To do this, you should answer, what is the type of voice? What concepts influence the construction of the voice? What is the significance of each concept in relation to the text voice, i.e., list relevant examples of each concept and explain each example's influence on the voice. And you should do that in relation to features, devices, and conventions where possible. Next question, how would you describe the voice? Final question, what is the purpose and or effect of the voice? This question requires you to relate your discussion of voice to the other elements of the question. Then we looked at how to create voice, and overall, we'll just discuss that in Module 5. The example that we looked at in this specific part of the lesson was Project Hail Mary, and we discussed a few concepts that influence the construction of a narrative voice, namely narrative POV, and a few language features as well. Final main section of the lesson, multiple voices. Multiple voices basically just means multiple perspectives. Key takeaway, multiple voices doesn't refer to the presence of more than one type of voice, one type of authorial, directorial, or narrative voice in a text. Rather, it refers to the fact that each person or group of people in a text has a voice, and each voice can be used to communicate a perspective. For instance, Team Cap in Captain America Civil War, Team Cap is one voice, Team Iron Man is another voice. Together, they represent multiple voices in that text. Done! That's it for voice. I'm sorry for how long this lesson was. Hopefully you can see why it was necessary. If it's any consolation, this is probably going to be the longest lesson in the entire course, and you just finished it. If some things didn't make sense in this lesson, I strongly encourage you to go and revisit some of the concepts that we discussed that influence the construction of voice. If certain things didn't really make sense, it's likely because your understanding of those concepts, or at least one of them, is a bit hazy. So if you go and revisit them, it should fill in the gaps that were existent in this lesson. Once you're confident with those other concepts that influence the construction of voice, make sure you then go and complete the activities in relation to this lesson on voice. And enjoy some sushi while you're at it. That's it for this one. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, keep it simple.